I have never in my lifetime or in yours seen a president over-deliver on their campaign promises like Trump too had. And the second term, he's repealing things of decades of destructive policies in America, and they're just kind of looking around being like, yeah, what are you going to do? It's very baffling to me and kind of unprecedented.
Michael Malice just insisted that Trump has over-delivered on his campaign promises as it pertains to his second term, and is a very consequential president that's changing the political dynamics in Washington, D.C. And in this clip with Will Cain, he gets into his reasoning for that. I love Michael Malice. I have a feeling we're going to disagree on a lot here, though, but let's get into it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Well, I think during the campaign, a lot of us were like, all right, is this going to be more of the same? He got his butt handed to him by Fauci. Remember how Trump went out? It wasn't exactly like what we would have wanted, I think, as Americans. And he's delivering all these promises, and I started a Twitter thread. And then every day it was like, holy crap, judges are getting arrested for flouting the law. None of us saw that coming. All the people that he wanted to be nominated got through, despite some even Republican opposition. People did not see that coming. Him freeing Ross Ulbricht on day 2. A lot of us were hopeful that ended up happening. So every single day I was like, holy crap, can this guy keep it up? And after 100 days, he did. I think this was you and I are no spring chickens. And I think it's fair to say, I have never in my lifetime or in yours seen a president over-deliver on their campaign promises like Trump too had. So, the book Not Sick and Winning just goes through those 100 days and just shows every single day it was just win after win after win. And to this day, I don't think his opponents really know how to fight him. They're still scrambling.
Let me ask you a question that I've started.
Okay, so a few things here. The repeals he's talking about, I think, pertain to things like, removing DEI from the executive offices, which is great. It doesn't seem to affect DEI as it pertains to the rest of the country. Obviously, I wouldn't expect it to. Private companies have the ability to adopt whatever measures they want in that regard. It's consequential, but is it the same as like ending a war? No, it's not to me. And I guess this pertains to kind of how you prioritize your issues and what's more important to you. And as far as his political opponents not being able to take this on, that part I really disagree. I think his political opponents have eaten away at his approval, especially over the Epstein cover-up. And that includes some people in his base, but his opponents have really latched onto that in a way that they didn't latch onto that story whatsoever under Biden, where he had very few Democrats speaking up about this, the cover-up, the scandal in general. Who are the feds and the FBI, covering for over this scandal that, probably implicated some of the most prominent legal and political and business minds in the entire world. They are effectively taking advantage of that and using it against Trump in ways that things like spending and the war in Ukraine and the war in Iran has not eroded his support, but the Epstein scandal has.
Bring up somewhat trollishly, but also provocatively and definitely earnestly.
I hate trolling.
With my friends at barbecues. To your point.
Yeah.
Do you think President Trump, based upon these first 100 days and the continuation, has really put himself in position to be a Mount Rushmore level president? I contend that I think he's one of the most consequential presidents of at least the last half century. But I think you can expand that timeline much longer. And whether or not you hate President Trump or you love President Trump, he's consequential. And I think that puts him on pace for some very, very distinguished company.
Well, in all fairness, Jefferson didn't do crap as president, other than the Louisiana Purchase. Teddy Roosevelt is someone I certainly would not want to have up there if I had my druthers. And he's only up there because I think he was friends with the sculptor. He really didn't earn his place. And I think very few people would say, of the important presidents, Teddy Roosevelt would be number 4. In terms of consequentialism, during the campaign, if I sat down with you and I said, Will, I got this crystal ball, and when Trump comes into office, not only is he going to pardon all the January 6 people, he's going to repealing Lyndon Johnson-era executive orders and eliminate DEI and a lot of these racialist programs in the government, you'd be like, okay, look, kid, it's nice that you think that, but let's be serious. That's not how Washington works. There are so many things he did that weren't even on the table during the campaign. And what I'm most shocked about is after he's done it, you would think that the Democrats, who for like 8 years have been in uproar, white supremacy, very fine people, all this nonsense, that they'd be like, holy crap, he's doing it, let's flip out. And they're kind of shrugging their shoulders. There's a huge disconnect between the first and second term, because the first term, he wasn't really doing much on these issues, and they were acting like the sky's falling. And the second term, he's repealing things of decades of destructive policies in America, and they're just kind of looking around being like, yeah, what are you going to do? It's very baffling to me and kind of unprecedented.
Well, I think
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, in the first few days of his presidency, I think you can say that about certain things. I think that Malice is talking a little bit about things like this that he repealed, that as it pertains to affirmative action in federal government hiring and employment. Trump did repeal this executive order, initially passed by Lyndon Johnson in 1965. This was something he repealed in terms of reversing kind of the DEI management style of the executive branch and the federal government in general. That is consequential. He also withdrew from the World Health Organization. I've given him props for that. That's a pretty big deal too. I don't want any globalist health organization, pushing down mandates that the U.S. is a partner in adopting and cooperating. That's absurd. He's done other stuff like release the JFK files, but other than that, man, I'm just not seeing it that much. And I got to agree or disagree with Malice on Jefferson. Outside of the Louisiana Purchase, he initiated the Lewis and Clark expedition. He ended all internal taxes in the United States from the feds. Imagine that. No internal taxes whatsoever. He also launched the first Barbary War. It wasn't really a war per se, but more or less of kind of an on-again, off-again series of naval clashes for the most part. Some sparring on land and the taking of Darren in that war. His fiscal restraint was unmistakable. He reduced federal debt despite taking on $15 million worth of debt over the Louisiana Purchase by selling land. And because of that, he reduced, the debt like something like $50 million during that time. He also initiated the Embargo Act. I think that's the worst thing he ever did, but that's tangential, but I had to get into Jefferson. But I don't see Trump's presidency the same way as Malice, certainly so.
They're trying, don't you think, Michael? But it's just all become so very impotent. It's as though they dulled that knife during Trump 1. Right. And probably even before Trump 1, this all started, whatever happened here, I would say roughly towards the tail end of President Obama's presidency, the racialism of everything in America, the accusations that anybody that disagrees with you is something phobic. It all just became a dulled knife. And I think they're still trying to run out many of those same slurs. He's Hitlerian, he is an authoritarian, but it just doesn't cut.
But I'm going to disagree with you a little bit, because if you're calling me Hitler one day and the next day I'm a king, that's really kind of a promotion. Like, it's like kings are good often. So, like, talk about a retreat. But to your point, yeah, I made this point in 2016. I tweeted out ago, if you're calling someone a Hitler every day, where do you go from there? Like super mega Hitler? I mean, if everything's always on 10, this is like kind of this Greta Thunberg idea of politics, that everything has to be a calamity and it's an existential threat to the world and it's happening right now. And if we don't stop it, blah, blah. And then at the same time, there's some kind of surprise that people try to take a shot at the guy. Well, yeah, if you're saying someone's about to bring about the end of not only America, but the earth, it's incumbent on people to, act on this. So those chickens came home to roost, as we saw in Butler, Pennsylvania. And I think for some Democrats, especially in the leadership, they took a step back like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, this is going off the rails. And once violence starts getting introduced into the equation, no one's safe. It's not going to end up just being for Republicans at all.
Yeah, I totally agree with this. This is a great point. Once you say someone's Hitler so many times over and over, no matter what they do, it just doesn't stick anymore. If that's what you go to next, is that they're still Hitler, despite the fact that now there's like a 4-year track record of this guy not exactly being Hitler for whatever, hostility we have toward him. And I have a lot. I'm not a fan of Trump whatsoever, if you didn't gather that. But, I think it's just so preposterous to even entertain the idea that, Trump's a Mount Rushmore type president. If your conception is that's like the ideal for presidents, which mine is not, by the way. I'm not a big fan of Theodore Roosevelt or Abraham Lincoln. We won't get into the reasons for that here. We can in other videos. But yeah, I think he's right about that. In a way, calling him a king was a promotion of sorts. I just don't see that the Democrats have, taken advantage of this so much outside of Epstein, which might help them in the midterms. And his approval rating has been suffering. It's not just Epstein. It's over, the war in Ukraine. He's not ended that. A lot of his support base is just being quiet about that issue right now. He's sending unlimited funding to Israel to enact a genocide in Palestine, sucking the U.S. into a war with Iran, sucking the U.S. into bombing Yemen for a month. Not saying that there isn't duplicity in the U.S. government supporting that too. There obviously is. But I don't agree that, his first term was so different in so many ways in that, he wasn't able to drain the swamp, but he surrounded himself with, John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. Well, this term, he's surrounding himself with people that are indistinguishable from those people, like Marco Rubio and Mike Huckabee and Mike Waltz for a time. He's gone now. But you see the same kind of dynamics playing out. It's just a little bit different marketing. And he doesn't have the deep state going after him for 3 years over Russiagate. That is the difference. But we're not seeing it play out generally in terms of policy for the most part.
I don't see it as a promotion that they've moved from Hitler to King. I think it's just an illustration of their incoherence. I think, to your point, the way that you have lathered up the public into this fearful state of psychosis,
sure,
they're just grasping for any slur.
Sure.
And maybe they too feel that Hitler has been dulled and they're tired of saying that. They got to find something new, but it's all going to be incoherent.
But I don't think being a king's a slur. I mean, if someone calls me go off king, I'm not going to, take a swing at them like if they call me Hitler.
No, but they think it is. To your point, you may not think it is, but they think it is. They think no kings is the same thing as saying Hitler.
Well, did you see that when Trump tweeted out, he goes, "Oh, congrats to everyone marching. I heard there was a movement to create a king, but thankfully you stopped it, and I'm still your president." So the fact that he could so humorously deflate their agenda, and also to the no kings thing, I think you and I agree, and everyone listening to this probably agrees, it seems very entirely astroturfed. This was not some kind of organic movement. This clearly seemed to be, if not Soros money, something like that. It just happened very quickly for my own taste. And it's also just bizarre to me because Democrats, like Joe Biden, in the 90s were very big on campaigning on a strong border and protecting the workers. And now it's like, we don't have an open border, but it's a good thing that we do. That speaks to what you were talking about with incoherence. And I think they're desperate to find a cudgel to hit the guy with. But after someone's been shot, it's really hard to follow that up with anything that's going to land.
Yeah, this is true. And I want to give him credit. This was before the Epstein cover-up really transpired in the Trump administration. So I have to take that back and saying like he's just ignoring that. This was recorded before that happened. So I want to just say, things might have changed since then, and Malice may have changed his viewpoint and shifted it to accommodate to some extent. But still, even in the grand conception of things leading up to this date, which was late June that this was recorded in, I mean, Trump got in a war with Iran. He passed a Biden-level CR. I don't think the big, beautiful bill was passed yet, which I call the big, abominable bill. But all signs were indicating that he was going to whip his supporters to pass it. And it did eventually pass, adding $5 trillion to the debt, as Thomas Massie always warned about. And that's why Trump dragged Massie and complimented Mitch McConnell and endorsed Lindsey Graham. That's why.
Well, let's return in a minute to President Trump,
sure,
how consequential he is, where his place is in American history. But let's stay on this thread of the left for a moment. The incoherence seems to be its identifying trait at this
sure
point, because the only tie that really binds the modern left is anti-Trumpism.
That's right.
So wherever he goes, they find themselves pivoting in the opposite direction.
That's
to
right.
The point that you and I talked about a little bit earlier this week on television, waving Iranian flags. And we don't have to rewind the clock that long ago that you could have at least described a coherent ideology or set of policies that define the left. Pro-union.
Sure, yeah.
Dovish on foreign policy.
That's right.
And today, none of those things apply. We'll also analyze together the right in a moment, but the only thing that binds the left is hatred of Donald Trump, and it makes you wonder, where then do you go after Donald Trump?
Well, I think the Democrats took a big hit to their leadership class. Pelosi stepped down. Biden was driven out of office. Officer Harris got her ass handed to her in the election. So it's like, which way, Western man, right? So you have the AOC Bernie Sanders wing with a Democratic Socialist wing, and then you have that Hillary Clinton, Chuck Schumer, Wall Street corporate Democratic hack wing, and they don't know which one is going to return them to power, which is the only thing they care about, obviously. But I also think they're in a good position for the midterms because they're going to have a lot of good data there because they're going to run AOC-type candidates in some races. They're going to run these so-called moderates in other races. They can see which ones get the wins, and they can run on that in that direction in 2028.
Yeah, this is a really good point. There is that dynamic in the Democratic Party. A lot of right-wingers don't see this, I don't think, and they just lump Mondami and Pelosi into the same category a lot of the time. You know, and just say that both are far left, like Pelosi and Schumer are far left, right? Well, people that watch this show will laugh at that, but that is the case. And a small-scale civil war did play out in the Democratic Party in 2016 over this issue and the populist support that Bernie had versus Hillary. We saw how that transpired. You know, the Democrats did everything they could to prevent the rise of Bernie, giving Hillary the keys to the kingdom, right? And that bit them in the ass. And Bernie kind of bent over and took it, man, endorsing her completely, having no issue with it. Same thing kind of happened with the Republicans in 2012 when Mitt Romney vied with Ron Paul, and Ron Paul won some major victories, including the primary in Iowa ultimately, and the RNC did whatever they could to stifle him. They changed the rules such that his delegates wouldn't count for anything, at least much, in the national convention. So that's how this happened, but he's right. We're going to get more data on that given the midterms and see how the Democrats prepare for 2028. I'm not sure if they'll just, go with another stuffed shirt like Harris or Biden again. It seems like they thought that that was the road to success, but it was nothing but. And I don't know how you defend their marketing campaign. I don't see, a prominent voice that I think has a lot of clout on that side to be able to do much, but probably Gavin Newsom and Whitmer and maybe AOC will run, and we'll see what happens.
You've helped popularize the term, the new right. Now, I said President Trump was consequential, and you talked about what he's been able to accomplish in office, notably during his second term. But I think his consequentialism is not just based upon these first 100 days of his presidency. It's the way that over a decade now, he has completely repositioned the Republican Party.
That's correct, yes.
And that in and of itself puts him in a discussion of only a handful of presidents. He has completely turned what it means to be a Republican. Has he turned what it means to be a conservative? Might be a deeper conversation. But one that is concerned with the middle class, one that is concerned with blue collars, one that has trade barriers instead of NAFTA, one that, even though we're sitting here today with a burgeoning war between Israel and Iran, seeks less interventionist foreign policy. And that in and of itself is massive for President Trump.
And to your point, I think the level of hatred by many Trump supporters towards the traditional Republican Party is worse than the hatred of many Democrats for the traditional Republican Party. The hatred towards people like Mitch McConnell, Lisa Murkowski, Mitt Romney, and these types who they regarded, quite understandably, as selling out both conservatism, republicanism, and Americanism. It's just through the roof. And I think one of the things that got him the nomination, as you and I remember very well, was when in 2015, 2016, during those debates, he basically just slapped the heck out of all those other candidates who had decades of experience between them, and the audience just gave him standing ovations one after another because people had enough. There was a book by Phyllis Schlafly, which she wrote in 1964 when Goldwater got the nomination over the enormous opposition in the Republican establishment, called A Choice Down an Echo. And she's like, every 4 years, someone pretends to be conservative, and then when they campaign for the presidency after getting the nomination, they say Me Too. Thomas Dewey, Edison, Nixon in 60. She's like, we need a choice as Americans. And no matter what you say about Donald Trump, you can't say that he's a big choice versus Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden. This is not like Mitt Romney and Obama having a big Venn diagram of overlap in many ways.
I think the overlap's much more than he's saying. The presentation, the approach, and the theatrics are very different, but we still have, the surveillance state, the same wars. We still are Israel first to the core in terms of our government and what interests they really represent. They still funnel money and power and monopolistic privileges to JP Morgan and Pfizer and Bank of America and Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. We still have the Ukraine war going on. We still have bludgeoning spending, absurd spending that will probably, trump, pardon the pun, all previous presidents in terms of spending. I don't see that much that's that different, other than the theatrics, the optics, this idea that Americans are captivated by, but that there's this grand clash of ideologies. I agree with him, though, in that there are a lot of Republicans and people on the right, especially on the dissident right, that, loathe people like, Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham more than even Democrats, because they'd say, well, at least the Democrats are being honest about, their mentality of trampling the Constitution and ushering in socialism or the Green New Deal. That is what they would say. So I'm with them on that. And this idea that Trump has been more of a non-interventionist or putting that forward more is absolutely crazy. He's escalated the war in Yemen. He's brought us into a new war with Iran that even Biden wasn't willing to do. He's more pro-Israel and more look the other way when it comes to whatever Netanyahu and his crazy, vile, criminal Likud coalition wants to do there. And it is occupied, according to them. Expand the West Bank settlements in Syria and Lebanon, recognize the Golan Heights, recognize expanded borders for Israel, and prevent any kind of two-state solution from ever taking place. That's this administration. It's not non-interventionist, or even more relatively non-interventionist than the Biden term. I hate to say. Biden pulled us out of Afghanistan. Was it a disaster in many ways? Yeah, it was. They left millions of weapons behind for the Taliban, which, by the way, replaced the Taliban after 20 years and billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives lost in that process, but that is the truth.
In 2012. And one more thing that he did remake, he remade politics in general, because for decades, the Republicans went after Democratic politicians while allowing agencies like the Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, MSNBC to take shots at them with impunity. Those were the people moderating the debates and making sure that the Republican candidate looked like a fool or as if even lying. And starting with Newt Gingrich when he ran for the presidency in 2012, and he took on the moderator in CNN, the first debate, John Carlin, I believe it was, Trump really made it normal. You see this with J.D. Vance all the time, with Ted Cruz now, Rand Paul, to realize Nancy Pelosi isn't anywhere near as much your enemy as the New York Times is. Because as old as she is, she's not as old as the New York Times, and her career won't last as long as they do. And people understand, even leftists, Nancy Pelosi is a Democrat, she's a partisan, she's a politician, but they think of the New York Times as honest, objective, but they're far more radical in their thinking than she is, and far more pernicious in their influence.
Yeah, I agree with that, actually, and that's why the legacy media is dying, by the way. Americans have taken notice of this for sure, and that explains the rise of the independent media, content creators such as me and others, people I cover here. And we see new views being exposed to the populace. Even on the right, when it comes to Israel especially, I've taken notice of this in the last year or two, over what's going on in Gaza and the dissent on the right for that issue. It hasn't manifested in big political victories against the Israel lobby yet, but I sure hope it does. But look, with the gift of more knowledge after this, maybe Michael Malice has changed his tune to some extent, but even by late June, I would not have been on this train. The Epstein cover-up hadn't happened yet, and I'd like to get his take on that. I haven't seen him actually speak about that in any major interview. I'd be willing to. I actually had thought prior to doing this that this was recorded more recently than late June, but even by that stage, we just don't agree on this. I think that we're mostly seeing a status quo deep state presidency with some tweaks of bells and whistles about DEI that's internal only to, the executive branch and sometimes the federal government in general. Some minor gestures like withdrawing from the World Health Organization. I think that's great, but that's not the same as ending a war, stopping the flow of money to, exacerbate a conflict with a nuclear power. How about that? Stopping a genocide. How about that? Actually reducing spending for once, when you made like Doge one of the cornerstone things of your campaign that projected to save, $2 trillion, make $2 trillion in cuts. And that was farcical, clearly so. A complete disaster that the Republicans just used as an electoral vehicle to get in power and then not care about spending, as they always do, by the way. They always outspend the Democrats in their administrations, despite saying they won't. And that's what we're feeling now. So, got to disagree with Malice on this one. I love the guy. He's brilliant. I love his books. The New Right's great. The White Pill is probably my favorite book of his. It tells the story about the rise and fall of the Soviet Union and really the hope that we can take from that. And, you know, we see some positive dynamics in the culture right now because Americans are waking up to some extent. And I do think it is because of the shift in the information. They don't own all the information anymore. It doesn't filter through 3 talking heads on the 3 biggest networks in the world anymore. But that's where we're at. Let me know if you disagree down below. Is Michael Malice right about this? Is Trump a president that's over-delivering in his second term, even if you're just going to consider up to June, late June, like he was talking about at this point? Let me know down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Will Kane. Thanks for this interview. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, it'll mean the world to me because you can support the channel, but I'll also give you a free gift in return by giving you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.